Question number 10.
Thank you very much.
Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Corrections and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa.
Yes, in the context in which they were given.
Supplementary question.
Order. Supplementary question. Chris Farfoy.
Does he stand by his decision on Monday to make no statement to Radio New Zealand on the issue that Mount Eden Prison, New Zealand's only privately run prison, has the highest number of prisoner assaults over the last 3 years? If so, why?
The Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa.
Sir, I did not make a statement on Monday, so in terms of Mount Eden Prison.
Order. I'm going to ask for the member, Chris Farfoy, to repeat the question, and if we could have some silence, it would assist the member in hearing, Minister in hearing the question.
Does he stand by his decision on Monday to make no statement to Radio New Zealand on the issue that Mount Eden Prison, New Zealand's only privately run prison, had the highest number of prisoner assaults over the last 3 years? If so, why?
Yes.
Supplementary?
Supplementary question, Chris Farfoy.
Why?
Well, I think the member just to elaborate. It's the second part of the question that wasn't answered before. The member's now repeating.
Say the question.
Yeah.
Why is he happy to stand by that decision?
Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa.
Sir, it's not related to any statement I made in terms of Mount Eden Prison.
Order. The Minister was asked a particular question, and the second part of that question was, if that was his decision, then why was it his decision? Now, the Minister chose not to answer that, which is perfectly in order. Supplementary questions, if they contain two legs, only one needs to be answered. The member has then asked in a second supplementary question why the Minister made that decision. That needs to be addressed by the Minister. I call the Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa. Would it assist the member if I got the question, the Minister, if I got the question asked again? Could I ask Chris Farfoy to ask the question?
Why does the Minister stand by his decision to not make a statement?
The Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa.
Sir, this is ridiculous. I didn't make a statement. I chose not to make that statement, and that's entirely up to me, whether I make a statement or not.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, it's not unreasonable to ask a minister why they chose a particular course of action and why they chose not to make a comment on something. Simply saying, because I didn't, isn't actually giving an answer. That's not an unreasonable question. There are reasons why ministers don't comment on things and don't, speak about particular issues. It's not unreasonable to ask why, in this instance, he chose not to comment.
Speaking to the point of order, Tim McIntyre.
Asked if the Minister stood by all of his statements. It is therefore illogical to the point of being a non sequitur to then ask the Minister why he doesn't stand by not making a statement. The two are not related, and that could not possibly be a supplementary to the original question.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of orders need to be heard in silence. Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, in his supplementary questions are related to the Minister's answer. In the Minister's answer, he stated, I made a decision, and therefore the supplementary question relates to that.
Order. I've heard enough, and I've certainly had plenty of advice coming from both sides. On this particular occasion, we've had the question now asked twice. The answer has not been satisfactory to the member asking the questions, and I can see why that has not been so. I think the best way forward is the member now has an additional supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Farfoy.
Given his officials told Radio New Zealand on Monday that the safety at Mount Eden Prison was an operational matter for his department, why did he say in a press release on the 21st of October that he was focused on improving safety for staff and prisoners?
The Honourable Pesatara Sam Lotaringa.
I am focused on improving staff for prisons. That's why I have visited in the last 2 weeks a number of prisons across this country. I've talked to the unions and corrections. I've talked to the officials, and I will continue to focus on that safety.
Supplementary question, Chris Farfoy.
Why are privately run prisons more dangerous than state-run prisons, given that there have been 139 fights between inmates and 26 assaults on guards at the privately run Mount Eden Prison, yet Christchurch Prison, with a similar sized muster, has a total of 83 assaults, and does he think it's because private run prisons run with much lower ratio of staff to inmates?
Honourable Pesatara, Sam Lotawinga, either of
No,
those
I dispute that assertion that privately run prisons don't run as effectively. In fact, they are two totally different types of prisons. One's essentially a remand prison, and so I actually disagree with that assertion.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question. Chris Farfoy.
Why on the 16th of November did he tell media that Philip Smith's escape was an operational matter and not his responsibility? And on Monday his officials told Radio New Zealand that assaults at Mount Eden prison are an operational issue and not his responsibility.
Honourable Pesatara, Sam Lotawinga.
Mr. Speaker, it is an operational matter in terms of Philip Smith. I did order an inquiry, a review into the incident around Philip Smith absconding. We have had 13 recommendations which the department is operationally adopting, and I will be keeping, as the Minister, a close eye on those recommendations being implemented.
Question.
Supplementary question, Chris Farfoy.
Seeing as the Minister thinks a lot of the things in his department are operational matters and not his responsibility.
Order. The member can see there the difficulty we get into.
If the Minister believes that a lot of the things that happen in his department are operational matters and not his responsibility, why was he given any responsibility at all?
Order. The Honourable Pesatara, Sam Lotawinga.
As I said, I, as the Minister, I am responsible for fixing some of the problems that have been incurred in the Philip Smith case. Some of those problems have been obviously at an operational level, but I'm here to fix them, and that's why I'm working alongside the department to take on the recommendations to fix these issues.
Question number 11, Ron Mark.